The frosting on Benjamin's birthday cake looked perfect. Smooth vanilla buttercream with delicate blue roses I'd piped by hand at 5 in the morning. 42 candles waited in the kitchen drawer, though I'd only put 4 and 2 on the cake itself. At 67, I'd learned that some gestures were more about the giver than the receiver. I adjusted my yellow dress, the one Benjamin had once said made me look presentable, and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back had steel gray hair pulled into a neat bun, lines earned through decades of caring for others, and eyes that held too many unspoken truths. Today felt different, though I couldn't name why. Perhaps it was the weight of the envelope I'd prepared 3 days ago, now hidden in my bedroom drawer alongside documents Benjamin had never bothered to read. The house smelled of roast beef and rosemary potatoes, his favorites, naturally. I'd spent the morning preparing everything just as I had for the past 25 years of his birthdays. The dining room table gleamed under the crystal chandelier William had bought me during our brief, happy marriage 15 years ago. William, who'd brought light back into my life after my first husband's death, who'd trusted me with his precious daughter Shirley when she was just 10 years old. Shirley. Even thinking her name brought warmth to my chest. At 40 now, she was everything I could have hoped for in a daughter. Brilliant, compassionate, fiercely loyal. She'd built herself into a formidable business executive, partly because of the opportunities I'd quietly provided, but mostly through her own determination. She called me every Sunday, visited monthly, and had never once made me feel like a burden or an obligation. Unlike my biological son, I heard Benjamin's key in the lock, followed by the familiar sound of his briefcase hitting the floor with more force than necessary. He was always angry about something these days. The traffic, his employees, the weather, the way I folded his shirts. At 42, my son had perfected the art of dissatisfaction. "Mom, I'm here," he called, his voice carrying that edge of impatience I'd grown to recognize. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, loosening his tie with quick, irritated movements. Benjamin had inherited his father's sharp features, but none of his kindness. Where my first husband had been gentle despite his flaws, Benjamin was hard edges and cold calculation. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "Everything's ready. I made all your favorites." He glanced at the spread I'd prepared. The roast, the potatoes, the green bean casserole, the cake. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Appreciation? No, more like inventory. He was cataloging my efforts not with gratitude, but with the cool assessment of someone tallying debts. "Thanks," he said, already heading toward the liquor cabinet. "I need a drink first. It's been a hell of a day." I watched him pour 3 fingers of the expensive whiskey I'd bought specifically for occasions like this. He never asked about my day, never wondered if I'd had a hell of a day too. At 67, my days were filled with managing the company he thought he ran, handling investments he didn't know existed, and maintaining the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to without ever questioning where the money came from. "How's the business?" I asked, though I knew the answer. I'd been reviewing the quarterly reports just that morning. "Fine," he said curtly, settling into his chair at the head of the table, the seat that had been William's, then became mine after his death, then somehow migrated to Benjamin without discussion. "Though I don't know why you insist on staying involved. You don't understand the complexities." I served his plate, piling it high with food I'd spent hours preparing. "I suppose you're right. I'm just a simple woman." He didn't catch the edge in my voice. Benjamin had always been remarkably deaf to subtlety when it didn't serve his interests. We ate in relative silence, punctuated only by his complaints about vendors, employees, and market conditions. I made appropriate sounds of sympathy and concern, playing the role I'd perfected over the years. The devoted mother, the supportive presence, the woman who existed primarily to make his life easier. "I saw Shirley last week," I mentioned casually, cutting my roast into small pieces. "She's doing wonderful things at her firm." Benjamin's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Even now, 22 years later, mentioning my stepdaughter could still trigger his resentment. "I'm sure she is. You always did think she walked on water. She's worked very hard for her success. Haven't we all?" He took a large gulp of wine, Some of us just don't have the luxury of starting with advantages. I set down my fork carefully. This was familiar territory. The subtle accusations, the implication that I'd somehow favored Shirley over him. The irony wasn't lost on me. Benjamin had inherited more advantages than most people could dream of, but he'd convinced himself he was perpetually shortchanged. "You've had plenty of advantages, Benjamin." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right, like having my mother remarry and suddenly having to share her attention with some other man's kid. William was a good man. He was good to both of us. He was good to you. He tolerated me because he had to." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with these conversations. William had tried so hard with Benjamin, had bent over backward to include him, to be the father figure he'd lost. But Benjamin had been 12 when I remarried, old enough to resent the intrusion, young enough to blame me for every perceived slight. That's not true, and you know it. "What I know," Benjamin said, his voice growing harder, "is that everything changed when you brought them into our lives. Suddenly, I had to compete for your attention, had to watch you fuss over that little girl like she was some kind of precious princess. I thought of 10-year-old Shirley, devastated by her mother's death just 2 years earlier, trying so hard to be good, to not be a burden. I thought of the nights I'd held her while she cried for her mama, the way she'd gradually learned to trust me, to let me love her. I thought of Benjamin's sullen resentment, his cold shoulder, his determination to make her feel unwelcome in what he considered his house. She was a grieving child, Benjamin. She needed care. And I didn't? I'd just lost my father, and then suddenly I had to share my mother with strangers. The candles on his birthday cake seemed to flicker in my peripheral vision. 42 candles for 42 years of this. 42 years of walking on eggshells around his feelings, of managing his resentments, of trying to balance his needs against everyone else's. "You never lost me," I said quietly. "I was always there for you." Benjamin finished his wine and reached for the bottle. His movements were getting looser, more expansive. Alcohol always made him bolder, more willing to voice the grievances he usually kept simmering just below the surface. "Were you?" He looked at me with eyes that held decades of accumulated anger. "Because from where I sat, it looked like you were pretty busy playing mother to someone else's kid." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and cutting. I felt something inside me go very still, very quiet. This wasn't new. Benjamin had been perfecting these particular wounds for years. But tonight, on his birthday, surrounded by food I'd made and wine I'd paid for, in a house I owned and furnished, something in me reached a breaking point. "I did my best," I said simply. "Your best." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the calculating look he'd inherited from his father. "You want to know what I remember about your best? I remember you teaching her to drive while I had to take the bus. I remember you helping her with college applications while telling me to figure it out myself. I remember you crying at her graduation like she'd just won the Nobel Prize." Each accusation was a small knife, carefully aimed. The terrible thing was that some of them held grains of truth. I had helped Shirley more than Benjamin in certain ways. But what he conveniently forgot was that by the time Shirley came into our lives, Benjamin had already established his pattern of rejecting help, of pushing away support, of interpreting every gesture of love as either insufficient or suspect. "I helped you too," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "Did you?" Benjamin's laugh was bitter. "Name one thing, Mom. One meaningful thing you've done for me." The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could have listed 1,000 things. The sleepless nights when he was sick, the school events I never missed, the way I'd quietly arranged for him to have a job at the company, the bills I'd paid, the problems I'd solved, the way I'd stepped back and let him believe he was running everything himself. But looking at his face, I realized the futility of it all. Benjamin had spent 42 years building a narrative in which he was the victim, and I was the inadequate mother. No list of sacrifices would penetrate that armor. No accounting of love given would balance his books of resentment received. I smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and sad and final. "You're right," I said. "I've never done anything for you. The words seemed to surprise him. He'd been expecting an argument, a defensive recitation of my maternal resume. Instead, I'd given him exactly what he'd asked for: validation of his grievances. "Well," he said, suddenly looking uncertain, "I didn't mean—" "No, Benjamin. You're absolutely right." I stood up, beginning to clear the dishes. "I've never done anything meaningful for you. Never sacrificed or struggled or worried or worked on your behalf. You've managed everything all by yourself." I could see him trying to process this unexpected capitulation. He'd won the argument, but victory felt hollow when the opponent refused to fight. We finished dinner in silence. I served the cake, sang happy birthday in a voice that sounded strangely distant to my own ears, and watched him blow out his candles. He made a wish, probably for something he believed I'd never given him. After he left, I sat in the gathering darkness of my dining room, surrounded by the debris of celebration. The house felt different now, charged with the electricity of impending change. I thought about the envelope upstairs, about the phone calls I would need to make, about the conversation I would have with Shirley tomorrow morning. Benjamin wanted to know what I'd never done for him. By tomorrow night, he would have his answer. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in William's old leather chair, the one Benjamin had always coveted but never dared claim, and watched the hours crawl toward dawn. The house held its breath around me, as if sensing the earthquake that was about to reshape its foundation. At 5:30, I made coffee and called Shirley. "Susan." Her voice was thick with sleep, but immediately alert. 22 years of being my daughter had taught her to recognize when something was wrong. "What's happened? Can you come over this morning? We need to talk." "Of course. Give me an hour." I spent that hour in my home office, a room Benjamin had never bothered to enter because he assumed it contained nothing more than recipe collections and charity correspondence. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so tragic. Here, surrounded by financial statements and legal documents, I'd spent 15 years quietly building and managing the empire he thought he controlled. The company, Johnson Logistics, had been William's modest trucking business when we married. After his death, I'd transformed it into a multi-million-dollar operation through careful expansion, strategic partnerships, and shrewd investments. Benjamin believed he'd done this work. He gave interviews to trade magazines about his business acumen, networked at conferences as the company's visionary leader, and basked in the respect of his peers. He had no idea that every major decision flowed through me, that his signature on contracts was merely a formality, that the CFO called me first when problems arose. Benjamin was the public face of Johnson Logistics, but I was its heart, brain, and backbone. Shirley arrived precisely 1 hour later. As she always did, she knocked twice and entered with her key, calling out as she came through the foyer. "In the office," I replied. She appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop near her apartment, her dark hair pulled back in the efficient ponytail she favored for weekend mornings. At 40, Shirley had inherited her father's height and her mother's delicate features, but her strength was entirely her own creation. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater that made her look younger than her years, though her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her one of the youngest senior partners at her consulting firm. "You look terrible," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the blunt honesty that had always characterized our relationship. "I feel terrible." She studied my face with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read my moods before she'd learned to read books. Benjamin's birthday dinner didn't go well. It wasn't a question. Shirley had weathered enough of Benjamin's storms to recognize the aftermath. "He told me I've never done anything for him." Shirley's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "He said what?" I repeated Benjamin's words exactly, watching as her expression shifted from surprise to anger to something harder and more resolved. Shirley had spent her childhood trying to win Benjamin's acceptance, her teenage years avoiding his cruelty, and her adulthood maintaining careful distance from his toxicity. She knew better than anyone how his mind worked. "And what did you say?" I agreed with him. This time, she did set down her coffee cup. "Susan, I told him he was right, that I'd never done anything meaningful for him. I opened the folder I'd prepared the night before, and now I'm going to make sure that's true." Shirley leaned forward, her business instincts sharpening. What are you planning? I slid the documents across my desk. I'm disappearing, sweetheart. And I'm taking everything with me. She picked up the papers, legal transfers, financial authorizations, property deeds. Her eyes widened as she processed the scope of what I was showing her. The company, she breathed. The house. The investments. Everything's being transferred to me? Everything Benjamin believes he owns. Everything he's taken credit for. It's all going to you. Johnson Logistics will have a new CEO as of Monday morning. The house will be yours by next weekend. His trust fund, which he's never bothered to examine closely, will be frozen pending restructuring. Shirley looked up from the documents, her face pale. Susan, this is nuclear. Yes, it is. He'll be devastated. Destroyed. Good. The word came out harder than I'd intended, carrying decades of suppressed anger. Shirley had heard me frustrated, disappointed, even hurt, but she'd never heard me sound ruthless. I need you to understand something, I continued. This isn't a momentary decision born from one hurtful comment. This is the culmination of 42 years of watching my son systematically diminish every gesture of love I've made toward him. He's convinced himself that I'm a failure as a mother, that I've never provided him with anything of value. So I'm going to give him the gift of being right. Shirley set the papers down carefully. Where will you go? I've bought a house in Asheville. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I'll transfer there quietly, set up a new life. I paused, studying her face. The question is whether you want to take on Johnson Logistics. It's a good company, profitable, with excellent growth potential. But it also means dealing with Benjamin when he realizes what's happened. He'll fight this legally. He can try, but he has no legal standing. The company has always been in my name. William left it to me, not to Benjamin. The house is mine. The investments are mine. Benjamin has been living in a fantasy where hard work and masculine authority entitled him to ownership, but legal reality is different. Shirley was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the logistics, but the emotional earthquake I was describing. Finally, she spoke. He's going to hate me even more than he already does. Probably. He'll blame me for this. He'll say I manipulated you, turned you against him. Let him. She picked up one of the documents, the transfer of company ownership. Susan, are you sure about this? Once you do this, there's no going back. Benjamin will never forgive you. I thought about Benjamin's face the night before, the cold calculation in his eyes as he delivered his verdict on my maternal failures. I thought about the years I'd spent walking on eggshells, trying to balance his needs against everyone else's, accepting blame for his disappointments and credit for none of his successes. I don't want his forgiveness, I said. I want my freedom. Shirley nodded slowly. When? I'm leaving tonight. I've already moved most of my personal belongings, did it gradually over the past month so Benjamin wouldn't notice. The movers will come Monday for the rest. By the time Benjamin wakes up tomorrow morning, I'll be in North Carolina, and you'll be the legal owner of Johnson Logistics. What about his job? That's up to you. You're the new CEO. If you want to keep him on as an employee, that's your decision. But he'll be working for you now, not the other way around. The delicious irony wasn't lost on either of us. Benjamin, who'd spent years resenting his little sister, would now be dependent on her goodwill for his livelihood. There's something else, I said, reaching for another folder. Benjamin's always believed he was entitled to an inheritance when I die. He's made comments over the years about the house being his someday, about carrying on the family business. I want him to understand exactly what he's lost. I opened the folder to reveal a detailed financial statement, the true scope of Johnson Logistics' worth, the property values, the investment portfolios, the life insurance policies. The numbers were staggering, even to Shirley. My God, Susan, you're worth more than Benjamin ever imagined. And now it's yours. Shirley stared at the figures, her business mind automatically calculating what this meant. This changes everything. Yes, it does. You'll be able to expand Johnson Logistics however you want. Buy that building you've been eyeing for your consulting firm. Travel. Invest. Live without financial constraints. I paused. Or you can give it all back to Benjamin and pretend this conversation never happened. She looked up sharply. Is that what you want? What I want is for you to have choices. Real choices, not the careful compromises you've been making your whole life because you didn't want to seem greedy or demanding. I reached across the desk and took her hand. You've earned this, sweetheart. Not through birth or entitlement, but through being the daughter I chose, and who chose me back. Tears had started in Shirley's eyes, but she blinked them away with characteristic determination. What about Benjamin's wife? His kids? Benjamin had married Judith 3 years ago, a woman as cold and calculating as he was, who'd produced 2 children and treated them more like accessories than people. Little Warren and Rosa, ages 5 and 3, were bright, sweet children who barely knew me because their parents considered my presence an inconvenience. Judith has a trust fund of her own. She'll be fine. As for the children, I hesitated. I've set up education funds for them that she can't touch. Whatever happens between Benjamin and me, Warren and Rosa shouldn't suffer for it. Shirley squeezed my hand. You really have thought of everything. I've had time to plan. We spent the next 2 hours going through details. Bank account transfers, legal authorizations, contact information for key employees and clients. Shirley took notes with the methodical precision that had made her such a successful consultant, but I could see the emotional weight settling on her shoulders. There's one more thing, I said as we finished. I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let guilt make you soft with him. Benjamin is going to paint himself as the victim in this story. He's going to claim I've abandoned him, that you've stolen his birthright, that he's been betrayed by the 2 women who should have loved him most. I met her eyes. But remember what he said to me last night. Remember all the years he made you feel unwelcome in your own home. Remember that he chose this path. Shirley nodded. I'll remember. And remember that you deserve everything I'm giving you. Not because you're perfect, but because you've loved me without conditions, supported me without reservation, and never once made me feel like my care was inadequate or unwanted. As the sun set that evening, I loaded the last of my belongings into my car. The house felt hollow, stripped of the personal touches that had made it mine. Tomorrow, Benjamin would wake up to find me gone, and his entire world restructured. By Monday, he would learn that the business he thought he controlled, the security he'd taken for granted, and the inheritance he'd assumed were all in someone else's hands. I thought about the envelope I'd left on his doorstep, a letter explaining exactly what he'd lost and why. But more than that, I thought about the road ahead, about the house in Asheville waiting for me, about the possibility of building a life based on my own choices rather than other people's needs. For the first time in 42 years, I was free. Benjamin woke up hungover and satisfied. The birthday dinner had gone exactly as he'd expected. His mother fussing over him, serving his favorite foods, accepting his criticisms with that martyred patience she'd perfected over the years. Even better, he'd finally said what needed to be said. The truth about her failures as a mother, her misplaced priorities, her obvious preference for that stepdaughter who'd never belonged in their family to begin with. He rolled out of bed at 9:30, later than usual, but justified by the previous night's celebration. Judith had already left for her yoga class, taking Warren and Rosa to her mother's afterward. The house was blissfully quiet. Benjamin shuffled to the kitchen in his robe, expecting to find coffee already made. His mother usually stopped by Saturday mornings to tidy up and prepare breakfast. But the coffee pot was cold, the counters bare. He checked his phone for messages. Nothing. Typical, he thought with familiar irritation. One honest conversation and she's sulking. He'd give her a few days to get over it. Then things would return to normal. They always did. He made his own coffee and toast, grumbling about having to fend for himself. By noon, his hangover had faded enough for him to consider driving to the office. Johnson Logistics ran itself on weekends, but he liked to check in, to maintain the visible leadership presence that had earned him respect in the industry. Benjamin dressed carefully in one of the expensive suits his salary afforded. Italian wool, perfectly tailored, the uniform of a successful executive. He'd worked hard to build his reputation, to transform his stepfather's modest trucking company into a regional powerhouse. The business magazines that featured him regularly praised his innovative approaches, his strategic vision, his ability to modernize an old-fashioned industry. The drive to Johnson Logistics took 20 minutes through the suburban sprawl of Charlotte. Benjamin had always loved this route, loved seeing the company's trucks on the highway bearing the logo he'd redesigned 5 years ago. Johnson Logistics employed over 200 people across 3 states, and they all looked to him for leadership. But when he pulled into his reserved parking space, something felt wrong. The lot was nearly empty, normal for a Saturday, but there were 3 cars he didn't recognize clustered near the main entrance. One was a black sedan with government plates. Benjamin's satisfaction curdled into unease as he used his keycard to enter the building. Voices echoed from the direction of his office, his corner suite with its view of the warehouse operations. He recognized one voice, Harrison Webb, the company's longtime CFO. The others were unfamiliar. "Harrison?" Benjamin called out as he approached his office. "What's going on?" The conversation stopped abruptly. Harrison emerged from the office looking pale and uncomfortable, followed by 2 people Benjamin didn't know, a woman in a severe black suit carrying a briefcase, and a man with the generic appearance of a government bureaucrat. "Benjamin," Harrison said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." "About what? Who are these people?" The woman stepped forward, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "Mr. Smith, I'm Margaret Whitman, representing the legal firm of Whitman, O'Leary and Associates. This is Dennis Williams from the Department of Revenue. We're here regarding the ownership transfer of Johnson Logistics." Benjamin stared at her. "Ownership transfer? What are you talking about?" Harrison cleared his throat. "Benjamin, your mother has transferred all company assets to Shirley Finney, effective immediately. Ms. Finney is now the majority owner and CEO of Johnson Logistics." The words hit Benjamin like physical blows. "That's impossible. This is my company. I run this company." "You've been an employee of this company," Margaret Whitman corrected gently. "The business has always been owned by Susan Johnson, your mother. She inherited it from her late husband, William Johnson, and has maintained sole ownership throughout its operation." Benjamin felt the floor shifting beneath him. "No, that's not. I built this company. I made it what it is. According to our records," Dennis Williams interjected, consulting his tablet, "you've held the position of operations manager since 2018, with an annual salary of $185,000 plus benefits. While you've certainly contributed to the company's success, you've never held an ownership stake." "This is insane," Benjamin said, his voice rising. "Where's my mother? I need to talk to my mother." Harrison and the lawyers exchanged glances. "She's not available," Harrison said carefully. "But she left this for you." He handed Benjamin an envelope, thick, cream-colored paper with his name written in his mother's careful script. Benjamin's hands shook as he tore it open. "Benjamin, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. You told me I've never done anything for you, and I realized you were absolutely right, so I've decided to stop trying. Johnson Logistics was never yours. It was Williams, then mine, and now it belongs to Shirley. You've been an employee, not an owner, though I let you believe otherwise because it seemed to make you happy. The house you think you'll inherit someday? It's Shirley's now too, along with the investments, the properties, and everything else you've taken for granted. You wanted to know what I've never done for you? I've never taught you gratitude. I've never shown you consequences. I've never made you understand that love is not a one-way transaction. Now you'll have the chance to build a life based on your own merits, without relying on things you never owned and accomplishments that were never yours. Shirley will decide whether to keep you on as an employee. I suggest you treat her with more respect than you've ever shown me. You said I've never done anything for you. Now that's finally true." Susan Benjamin read the letter twice, 3 times, his mind struggling to process the implications. Around him, the lawyers and Harrison waited in uncomfortable silence. "This can't be legal," he finally said. "She can't just take everything." "I'm afraid she can," Margaret Whitman replied. "Mrs. Johnson has been the sole legal owner of all assets. The transfers have been properly executed and filed. Ms. Finney is now your employer, assuming she chooses to retain your services." Benjamin's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "This is Shirley. We need to meet Monday at 9 a.m. to discuss your future with the company. Don't be late. MF, CEO, Johnson Logistics. The casual authority in that message, the way she'd signed it with her new title, hit him like a slap. Shirley, the interloper, the usurper, the little girl who'd never belonged, was now his boss. I need to sit down, Benjamin said, stumbling toward his office chair. Actually, Harrison said quietly, this isn't your office anymore, Ms. Finney asked that you clear out your personal belongings today. Security will supervise. Benjamin looked around the space he'd considered his domain for the past 6 years. The mahogany desk, the leather chairs, the framed articles about his business success, none of it belonged to him anymore. Even the parking space with his name on it was no longer his. Where am I supposed to work? That's up to Ms. Finney, Margaret Whitman said. She'll discuss your employment status on Monday. The next hour passed in a humiliating blur. A security guard watched as Benjamin packed his personal items into boxes. Family photos, a few books, the Mont Blanc pen set Judith had given him for Christmas. Everything else, the computer, the files, the industry awards displayed on his shelves, belonged to the company, belonged to Shirley. As he carried his boxes to his car, Benjamin tried calling his mother. The number went straight to voicemail, and her mailbox was full. He tried the house phone, disconnected. He drove to her house and found it empty. A sold sign planted in the front yard. She was really gone. Benjamin sat in his car outside the house where he'd grown up, staring at windows that no longer lit up for him. The magnitude of his loss was beginning to sink in. Not just the company or the money, but the entire foundation of his identity. He'd spent years introducing himself as the CEO of Johnson Logistics, networking based on that reputation, building relationships on the assumption of continued success and financial security. His phone rang. Judith. How did the office visit go? She asked. Did you sign those new contracts? Benjamin closed his eyes. How could he explain this? How could he tell his wife that everything they'd built their life around was gone? That the inheritance they'd counted on, the security they'd taken for granted, had vanished in a single morning? Benjamin? Are you there? I'm here, he said. We need to talk when you get home. About what? You sound strange. Just, come home, Judith. Come home and we'll talk. He hung up and drove to his own house, a modest colonial that felt suddenly small and shabby compared to the mansion he'd expected to inherit. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The mortgage payment book on Judith's desk, the stack of bills she managed, the careful way she budgeted their expenses. His salary at Johnson Logistics had been generous, but it wasn't enough to support the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to. They'd been living on the assumption of future wealth, making purchases and taking vacations based on Benjamin's assurance that money would never be a problem. Now it was the only problem that mattered. Benjamin poured himself a drink and sat in his living room, surrounded by furniture they couldn't afford and photos of vacations they shouldn't have taken. In a few hours, Judith would come home with the children, expecting to find her successful husband relaxing after another profitable day at his company. Instead, she'd find a man who'd just discovered that his entire life had been built on foundations that belonged to someone else. The letter from his mother lay on the coffee table beside him, its words echoing in his mind. You said I've never done anything for you. Now that's finally true. For the first time in his adult life, Benjamin Smith had to face the terrifying possibility that he might have to succeed, or fail, entirely on his own merit. The thought was more frightening than he'd ever imagined. Judith arrived home at 4:30 with the children in tow, their voices bright with weekend excitement. Benjamin heard Warren chattering about the playground while Rosa sang a song she'd learned at her grandmother's house. Normal sounds of a normal Saturday afternoon in a life that was no longer normal. Daddy! Rosa burst through the front door first, her pigtails bouncing as she ran toward him. At 3, she was all energy and affection, too young to understand the storm that was about to reshape their family. Benjamin caught her in his arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair, trying to memorize this moment before everything changed. Warren followed more cautiously. At 5, he'd inherited some of his father's wariness, though in him, It manifested as thoughtful observation rather than resentment. "You're home early," Judith said, setting down her yoga bag and studying Benjamin's face. Even after 3 years of marriage, she could read his moods with uncomfortable accuracy. "What's wrong?" "Kids. Why don't you go play in the backyard for a while?" Benjamin suggested, forcing lightness into his voice. "But I want to show you my drawing from Grandma's house," Warren protested. "In a little bit, buddy. Mommy and Daddy need to talk first." Judith's expression sharpened. She'd learned to recognize the tone that preceded difficult conversations. After the children disappeared into the yard, she settled into the chair across from Benjamin with the deliberate composure she'd cultivated since childhood. Judith came from money. Old Charlotte money that had taught her to handle crises with cool pragmatism. Her trust fund had supplemented Benjamin's salary more than either of them liked to acknowledge, and her family connections had opened doors throughout their marriage. She was beautiful in a calculated way. With blonde hair she touched up monthly, and a wardrobe chosen for maximum social impact. "Well?" she said. Benjamin had spent the past hour trying to find the right words, some way to explain the inexplicable. But sitting across from his wife, seeing her expectant expression, he realized there was no gentle way to deliver this news. "My mother has taken everything," he said simply. Judith blinked. "What do you mean? Taken everything?" "The company, the house, all of it. She's transferred everything to Shirley and disappeared." For a moment, Judith said nothing. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. "That's impossible. Your mother doesn't have the authority to—" "She does. It was all hers. I never actually owned any of it." Benjamin watched his wife process this information, saw the exact moment when the implications hit her. Judith's face went through a series of calculations, financial, social, practical, before settling into the hard mask she wore when dealing with unpleasant realities. "Explain," she said. So Benjamin told her everything. The scene at the office, the lawyers, the humiliating discovery that he'd been an employee masquerading as an owner. He showed her Susan's letter, watched her read it twice with the same shocked disbelief he'd experienced. "She can't do this," Judith said finally. "There has to be something we can do. Challenge it legally. Prove mental incompetence. Something." The lawyers said it's all legal. She owned everything outright. Judith stood up and began pacing, her mind racing through possibilities. "What about your salary? Your position? Shirley will decide Monday whether to keep me on as her employee." The words tasted bitter. Benjamin had spent years dismissing Shirley as an interloper, treating her with barely concealed contempt whenever their paths crossed. Now she held his professional future in her hands. "This is about the stepdaughter," Judith said. "She's been working on your mother, turning her against you. This reeks of manipulation." Benjamin wanted to agree, to blame Shirley for orchestrating his downfall, but Susan's letter had been too specific, too detailed in its accusations. This wasn't manipulation. This was years of accumulated resentment finally finding expression. "I don't think so," he said quietly. "I think this is just Mom." Judith stopped pacing. "Just Mom? Benjamin, your mother was a housewife who remarried well. She doesn't have the sophistication to orchestrate something like this." "Apparently she does." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. Finally, Judith sat down again, her posture rigid with contained panic. "What does this mean for us? Financially?" Benjamin had been dreading this question. "Your trust fund will cover the mortgage and basic expenses. My salary, if I still have one, should be enough for everything else. My trust fund." Judith's voice was very quiet. "Benjamin, we've been living well above your salary for 3 years. The cars, the vacations, Warren's private school, this house, we bought all of it assuming your inheritance would cover the shortfall. I know. We're in debt, serious debt." Benjamin nodded miserably. They'd leveraged their future against his expectations, making purchases and commitments based on wealth that had never actually been his. "What about the children's college funds?" Judith asked. "Those were tied to the company's stock options I thought I had." Benjamin's voice cracked slightly. Stock options that apparently never existed. Judith stood up again, this time moving to the window that overlooked their carefully landscaped backyard. Warren and Rosa were building something elaborate with sticks and leaves, their laughter carrying through the glass. "We'll have to sell the house," she said. "Probably. Move somewhere smaller. Take Warren out of Montessori." "Yes. Cancel the trip to Europe we planned for Christmas." Benjamin nodded, though she couldn't see him. Each item on Judith's list was another piece of their life being stripped away, another assumption that had crumbled along with everything else. "I should call my father," Judith said. "See if he knows any employment lawyers." "To do what?" "To explore our options. Wrongful termination, breach of contract, something." She turned from the window, her expression hardening into the determined mask Benjamin recognized from her business dealings. "I'm not going to let some bitter old woman destroy our family because she had a tantrum." Benjamin flinched at her characterization of his mother, even though he'd said worse things himself over the years. Hearing it from Judith's lips made the cruelty more obvious somehow. "She's not bitter. She's angry. There's a difference." "Angry about what? You've been a good son. You've worked hard, built the company up." "I haven't built anything," Benjamin interrupted. "That's the point. She built it. I just showed up and took credit." Judith stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "That's ridiculous. You've worked 60-hour weeks for years. You've made that company what it is." "Have I? Or have I just been following plans she made, implementing strategies she developed, taking credit for successes she orchestrated?" Benjamin rubbed his face tiredly. "Reading that letter, thinking about everything that's happened, I'm not sure I've ever actually accomplished anything on my own." "Stop it." Judith's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare have a crisis of confidence now. We need to fight this, not fall apart." But Benjamin was already falling apart. The revelation that his entire professional identity had been a fiction was cascading through his sense of self, unraveling everything he'd believed about his capabilities and accomplishments. His phone buzzed with a text message. From Shirley. "Benjamin, I know this is difficult, but I want you to know that despite everything, I value your contributions to the company. We'll talk Monday about how to move forward. Try to have a good weekend with your family." The message was professional but not unkind. It was more consideration than Benjamin had ever shown Shirley during the years they'd known each other. "What does she want?" Judith asked, reading over his shoulder. "To talk Monday about my future. At least she's keeping you on." "Maybe. Or maybe she's just being polite before she fires me." Judith sank back into her chair, the fight temporarily draining out of her. "How did this happen, Benjamin? How did we not see this coming?" Benjamin thought about his mother's birthday dinner, about the careful way she'd served his favorite foods and listened to his complaints, about the quiet smile she'd given him when he'd delivered his final devastating judgment. "She tried to tell me," he said quietly. "Not directly, but she tried to show me. All those years, she kept managing things behind the scenes, kept solving problems I didn't even know existed. And I kept dismissing her, kept acting like she was just in the way. She was your mother. It was her job to support you. Was it her job to support me while I treated her stepdaughter like garbage? Was it her job to fund my lifestyle while I complained about everything she'd done wrong?" Benjamin looked at his wife, seeing for the first time how much she resembled him in her sense of entitlement. Maybe she got tired of having a job where the only payment was criticism. Judith's expression hardened. "I can't believe you're taking her side." "I'm not taking anyone's side. I'm just trying to understand how we got here." The back door opened and Warren tumbled inside, grass stains on his knees and dirt under his fingernails. "Daddy, come see what we built. It's a castle for Rosa's fairy dolls." Benjamin looked at his son, bright, eager, innocent of the catastrophe reshaping their world. In a few days, they'd have to start explaining why things were changing, why Daddy's job was different, why they couldn't afford the things they'd taken for granted. "Just a minute, buddy," Benjamin said. "Let me finish talking to Mommy." But as Warren ran back outside, Benjamin realized there was nothing left to discuss. The damage was done, the consequences set in motion. All that remained was figuring out how to build a life from the wreckage of their assumptions. And somehow, Monday morning, He would have to sit across from Shirley Finney and ask her for the mercy he'd never shown her. The irony wasn't lost on him. For the first time in his life, Benjamin would have to rely on the kindness of the woman he'd spent 22 years trying to make feel unwelcome in her own home. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, matching Benjamin's mood as he drove to Johnson Logistics for what might be his final day as an employee. He'd spent the weekend in a haze of financial calculations and difficult conversations, each one reinforcing the magnitude of his fall from grace. The parking lot felt different now that he knew he was just another worker reporting to someone else's company. His old reserved space near the entrance bore a new nameplate, M. Finney, CEO. Benjamin parked in the general employee section, walking past trucks and loading docks he'd never paid attention to when he thought he owned them. Inside, the Monday morning bustle continued as usual. Employees nodded to him with the same deference they'd always shown, unaware that the hierarchy had shifted beneath their feet. Benjamin wondered how long it would take for word to spread, how the revelation of his true status would change these interactions. He rode the elevator to the executive floor, his stomach churning with anxiety and wounded pride. The hallway that had once felt like his domain now seemed foreign, hostile. Outside what had been his office, he paused. Through the glass walls, he could see Shirley seated behind the mahogany desk, reviewing documents with the focused intensity he remembered from her childhood. Benjamin knocked and waited for permission to enter his former sanctuary. "Come in," Shirley called without looking up. She'd changed nothing about the office except for a single framed photograph on the desk, a picture of herself with Susan from last Christmas, both women smiling with genuine warmth. The sight of his mother's face, relaxed and happy in a way Benjamin couldn't remember seeing in years, hit him like a physical blow. "Sit down, Benjamin," Shirley said, finally meeting his eyes. At 40, she commanded the space with natural authority. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a charcoal gray suit that conveyed both professionalism and power. But her eyes, those were still the eyes of the 10-year-old girl who'd tried so hard to earn his acceptance. "How was your weekend?" she asked. The question seemed genuinely curious rather than mocking. Benjamin searched her expression for signs of gloating, for the satisfaction of victory, but found only professional courtesy tinged with something that might have been compassion. "Difficult," he admitted. "I imagine it was." She set down her pen and folded her hands. "Benjamin, I want you to understand that I didn't ask for this. Susan made this decision entirely on her own. But you accepted it." "Yes, I did. Because she asked me to, and because I believe she had the right to dispose of her property as she saw fit." Shirley's voice remained calm, measured. "But that doesn't mean I want to see you destroyed." Benjamin almost laughed at the irony. "Destroyed? I think we're already past that point." "Are we?" "That depends largely on the choices you make from here forward." Shirley opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. Benjamin recognized it as an employment contract. His employment contract, with several significant modifications. "I'm offering you a position as Regional Operations Manager," she said. "It's a step down from what you've been doing, but it's still a management role with real responsibilities. The salary is $95,000 annually, plus performance bonuses if the region meets its targets." Benjamin stared at the numbers. It was roughly half what he'd been making, but more than he'd expected given the circumstances. "Why?" "Because despite everything, you do know this business. You understand the clients, the logistics, the day-to-day operations. I'd be foolish to throw away that institutional knowledge out of spite." "But you could. Fire me, I mean. After everything Benjamin stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "After everything you what, Benjamin? Treated me badly when we were children? Made me feel unwelcome in my own home? Acted like I was stealing something that belonged to you?" Shirley's voice remained level, but Benjamin heard the steel beneath it. "Yes, you could have been kinder. But holding grudges is exhausting, and I have a company to run." Benjamin read through the contract terms, noting the performance requirements and behavioral expectations. It was generous under the circumstances, but it also made clear that he would be working for her, following her directives, answerable to her authority. "There are conditions," Shirley continued. "First, you report directly to me. No undermining. No going around my decisions. No attempts to rally other employees to your cause. Second, you treat everyone in this company with respect, from the executives to the warehouse staff. And third, if you have any contact with Susan, you will treat her with dignity. She's gone, Benjamin said quietly. I don't even know where she is. She's in North Carolina, Asheville. She bought a house near the mountains and she's very happy. Shirley's expression softened slightly. She's not hiding, Benjamin. She just doesn't want to hear from you right now. Did she say that? She said she needs time to heal from 42 years of feeling unappreciated, and that if you ever want a relationship with her again, you'll need to figure out how to become the son she always hoped you could be. The words hit Benjamin like stones, each one precisely aimed at the guilt and self-doubt he'd been carrying since Saturday. He thought about his mother alone in a strange city, starting over at 67, because her own son had made her feel unwanted in the life she'd built. What about my children? He asked. Warren and Rosa. Will they ever see her again? For the first time, Shirley's composure cracked slightly. Susan loves those children, but she won't use them as weapons against you, and she won't put them in the middle of this conflict. If you want them to have a relationship with their grandmother, you'll need to find a way to make that possible. Benjamin signed the contract without reading it again. What choice did he have? But as he wrote his name, he realized something had shifted in his thinking. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about facing the truth of who he'd been and who he might still become. Thank you, he said, and meant it. Shirley nodded. Your office is on the second floor. Rebecca will show you around and introduce you to the staff you'll be supervising. As Benjamin stood to leave, Shirley called after him. Benjamin? For what it's worth, I think Susan still loves you. But love isn't enough anymore. She needs to see change, real change, before she'll let you back into her life. That evening, Benjamin sat in his soon-to-be former dining room, helping Warren with homework, while Rosa colored at the table beside them. Judith was in the kitchen, making phone calls to real estate agents and private schools, beginning the practical work of downsizing their lives. Daddy, Warren said, looking up from his math worksheet. Why haven't we seen Grandma Susan lately? Benjamin's pencil paused over the arithmetic problem they'd been solving together. Grandma Susan moved away, buddy. She lives in a different state now. Is she mad at us? The innocence of the question broke Benjamin's heart. No, sweetheart. She's not mad at you or Rosa. She loves you very much. Then why did she leave without saying goodbye? Benjamin looked at his son's earnest face, so trusting and confused. How could he explain that Grandma Susan had left because Daddy had spent years being cruel and ungrateful? How could he make a 5-year-old understand that some hurts ran too deep for simple apologies? Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, Benjamin said carefully. And sometimes those mistakes hurt people we love. Grandma Susan needed some space to feel better. Will she come back? I don't know, Warren. Maybe someday. Rosa looked up from her coloring book. I miss Grandma Susan. She made the best cookies. I miss her too, Benjamin said, and realized it was true. That night, after the children were asleep, Benjamin sat alone in his study and opened his laptop. He typed, Susan Johnson, Asheville, North Carolina, into the search engine, but stopped before hitting enter. What was he looking for? Her address so he could show up and demand forgiveness? Her phone number so he could call and argue about fairness? Instead, he opened a new document and began to write. Dear Mom, I know you don't want to hear from me right now, and I understand why. I know you said I've never done anything for you, and I'm starting to realize how true that was. I spent 42 years taking everything you gave me and finding reasons why it wasn't enough. I made you feel unwelcome in your own life, because I was angry about things that weren't your fault. I treated Shirley badly because I was jealous of the love you showed her, never understanding that love isn't diminished by sharing it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm finally seeing clearly, and I don't like what I see. Shirley offered me a job today. She didn't have to do that. She could have fired me, could have made me pay for every cruel thing I said to her when we were kids. Instead, she gave me a chance to prove I can be better. I'm going to take that chance, Mom. Not because I expect you to care, but because I finally understand that being your son meant something, and I wasted it. Warren asks about you. Rosa misses your cookies. They love you without conditions, the way I should have, but never learned how. If you ever want to see them again, I promise I won't stand in the way. They deserve to know the grandmother who loved them before they could disappoint her. I hope Asheville is beautiful. I hope you're happy. I hope someday you'll be proud to call me your son. Love, Benjamin. He read the letter 3 times, then saved it to his drafts folder. Tomorrow he would have to learn how to be Shirley's employee, how to rebuild his career from a position of humility rather than entitlement. He would have to help Judith navigate their financial crisis, figure out how to provide for his family on a fraction of their former income. But tonight, he would sit with the weight of his mother's absence and try to understand what he'd lost when he'd pushed away the one person who'd loved him unconditionally. In Asheville, Susan Johnson stood on the porch of her new house, breathing mountain air and watching stars appear in a sky unmarred by city lights. For the first time in decades, she felt truly free. Free from the weight of other people's expectations. Free from the burden of loving someone who couldn't love her back. She thought about Benjamin sometimes, wondered if he was learning to stand on his own feet, if he was finally understanding the value of what he'd taken for granted. But mostly, she thought about the future, about the garden she would plant, the books she would read, the life she would build on her own terms. At 67, Susan had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to stop trying to save someone else. The mountains stood silent around her new home, offering no judgment, asking nothing, giving everything. It was enough. Finally, it was enough.